Welcome, Connecting Point. We're at week 4 of our series in Advent, and our theme this week is love. And so, as an entree into our topic today, I want to ask you to think about a repeated metaphor that is used in the scriptures to describe God's relationship to his people. So we're going to take a look at a few verses right now. Isaiah 62, verse 5. As a young man marries a young woman, so will your builder marry you. As a bridegroom rejoices over his bride, so will your God rejoice over you. Let's go down to the New Testament, Matthew 9, verse 15. And Jesus answered, how can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he's with them? The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and then they will fast. Or further down in Matthew 25, verse 1, at that time the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. In Revelation 21, verses 1 to 4 and then 9. And then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls full of the 7 last plagues came and said to me, come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. All right, with those in mind, let's throw you to your first table talk. What do you think about Jesus being compared to a bridegroom and the church being compared to a bride? Our contemporary society has completely lost the plot in thinking about love and marriage. We see vague or nonsensical declarations like love is love, often applied in really broken circumstances or to inclinations that are disordered. And we see that people think they mean something profound or compassionate with this tautology. We see a society that is by turns pornographic and then Puritan, either making a god out of our flesh and our lusts, or then trying to cancel people and shame them who have acted this way, and for not being sufficiently serious about what a serious business it all is. And we haven't really reckoned with the radical social change that's implied in all of our reproductive technologies that we have these days. We certainly haven't reckoned with the spiritual carnage that has been wrought by decades of infidelity, no-fault divorce, premarital hookups, cohabitation with no covenant, rampant pornographic usage, and all the other sexual foolishness that we observe in our society. But there's a reason that God would use this husband-wife relationship, among all the others that are possible, to describe the relationship of Christ to the church. It is the human relationship that most obviously engages in creation. It was ordained to be so by the very first human, since the time of the very first humans. Genesis 2, 23 and 24. The man said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. This is the bedrock of all of society, is this relationship between man and woman engaging in this ongoing cycle of recreation, right? Adam and Eve, though, broke the peace and the joy that was implied in their Edenic state, and the breakdown of this relationship is a big part of what needs to be redeemed as we get into the rest of the scriptures. And we see that God is actually working to do so in multiple places in the Old Testament. So I want to, as a kind of our study today, I wanted to review the role of the bridegroom throughout the scriptures to try to draw our attention to what real love looks like. And so in order to do this, I'm going to look first at 2 Old Testament bridegrooms, and then we'll turn to the New Testament and wrap up. So the first of these bridegrooms that I want to choose is King David's great-grandfather, Boaz. So I'll refer you back a couple years back. Tracy did an excellent deep dive into the book of Ruth. And so I'd encourage you to go and review her videos for the significant details of the story. For our purposes today, I'm just going to kind of rip through the story. So I want to concentrate specifically on Boaz as our character. Boaz is kind of the second main character in the very short book of Ruth, which you may recall takes place during the chaotic time of the Judges. Boaz is introduced in the second of Ruth's 4 chapters after Ruth, who is a Moabite, so an enemy from an enemy tribe to the Israelites. And Naomi and her husband had gone into Moab, and then Naomi's children had married 2 Moabite women. So Ruth is one of these Moabitesses. But all of the men died, and so the people that were left were the mother, Naomi, and then Ruth and her sister-in-law, Orpah. And so Ruth and Naomi end up going back to Israel. And Ruth makes this wonderful statement, your people will be my people and your God will be my God. And it's this statement of faith, this declaration of, no, I choose to identify with the people of faith in Yahweh rather than in whatever my past has been. So Ruth and Naomi travel back to Israel, and they're really poor because they're widows, and that's not a privileged people group at this time. And so what happens is, as they get back into Israel, Ruth ends up going out to try to work and gleans in a field after the workers who had already harvested the field. And that was a technique that was kind of used amongst the faithful in Israel at the time to provide charity for the poor, right? Was when we harvest, we don't harvest everything. We leave a margin for the people who are marginal to be able to eat. And so this shows that our field's owner, which turns out to be this guy, our guy in this story, Boaz, is one of these faithful Israelites who honors the law by generously leaving the edges of his fields for the poor, for the widow and the orphan as a provision for them. And then as Boaz finds out who this Ruth is and kind of sees her, he's like, oh yeah, leave a little extra for her kind of thing. And so her generous spirit begins to beget generosity in him. Naomi ends up finding about who it is that Ruth has gone and harvested from. And it turns out that Naomi and Boaz are kind of distant relatives. So she encourages Ruth to cultivate their connection. And the details of the story end up reading a little oddly to our modern mindsets, as we don't have the same sorts of cultural norms that resonate with us. We just don't see quite the same scandal in Ruth sleeping at the feet of Boaz and uncovering his feet, just not as big a deal to us. We also don't see things like trading sandals as being as significant as they are. There's an element of comedy and like romance to this whole story, though. Ruth breaks some cultural rules and essentially throws herself on Boaz's mercy. And Boaz seems a little taken aback by her forwardness, but he likes what he sees. And it's not just because Ruth is pretty, but because he sees her virtue through her love and faithfulness for Naomi. And so Boaz ends up risking his name, his property, his good reputation as a law-abiding, faithful Israelite by marrying this outsider. And it's one of the great, it's the great love story of the Old Testament. God ends up honoring Ruth's love for Naomi and Boaz's act of love for Ruth. And then Boaz and Ruth end up being in the lineage of the Messiah. So there's our first guy, and you'll see the summary on the screen. But Ruth and Boaz is kind of the comic version, in the old sense of a comedy with a happy ending and the whole thing, right? But we also see later down in the Old Testament a bit of a tragic version of the love story. The first of the minor prophets is a book called Hosea. So the title character is a prophet to Israel, and he is tasked at the beginning of the story to marry Gomer, who is a woman who has previously made a living working as a prostitute. So God tells him that this is going to be an object lesson for the people of Israel. So Hosea and Gomer start a family, but then the object lesson continues, and God instructs Hosea to name his children these 3 really depressing names. So the first one is a son who's called Jezreel, who's named after a location where Israel had committed a massacre under their king Jehu, and God was going to be punishing the nation for this massacre. The second child was named Lo Ruhamah, which was a daughter, and her name means not loved, which is pretty awful to tell your daughter that that's her name. Then the son afterwards is named Lo Ami, which means not my people. And so God is like using these children of this prophet whose job is to speak truth to the people of Israel, to describe how both that God is feeling unloved, but also that he's withholding his love from the people because of the breakdown of their covenant relationship, and kind of setting his face against them, that they're no longer going to be able to be his people, which is a very sad story. Now, as the story progresses, what happens then is Hosea writes a series of poems which detail his broken heart as Gomer ends up returning to her previous life. So at a certain point, God tells Hosea to go and buy her back out of this life of prostitution that she's returned to. And this all is acting as an object lesson for Israel. It's a really heartbreaking read as Hosea pours out just judgment and invective and relates his utter emotional desolation of a lover scorned. Hosea's point, though, is that as heartbroken as he is with his own family situation, it pales in comparison to the heartbrokenness of God, who has persistently loved Israel, and they've persistently turned to other gods. Nonetheless, the thing that you see through Hosea is this theme of forgiveness and restoration, which keeps poking through. And at the end of the story, Hosea implores Israel to repent, and then we read this final message from God's merciful heart. It starts in chapter 14, verse 4. I will heal their waywardness and love them freely, for my anger has turned away from them. I will be like the dew to Israel. He will blossom like a lily, like a cedar of Lebanon. He will send down his roots. His young shoots will grow. His splendor will be like an olive tree, his fragrance like a cedar of Lebanon. People will dwell again in his shade. They will flourish like the grain. They will blossom like the vine. Israel's fame will be like the wine of Lebanon. Ephraim, what more have I to do with idols? I will answer him and care for him. I'm like a flourishing juniper. Your fruitfulness comes from me. And it's this fact, this theme of God's faithfulness repeating, that ends up being the overriding message in the book of Hosea. Now, I've never successfully read through Hosea without tearing up, usually on multiple occasions. As you read through, what happens is you end up realizing that you are personally in the position of Gomer, the wandering lover who's strayed from the purpose that God has intended for you. But then you realize you're also Hosea, who's called to forgive and to love those who've done the worst stuff they possibly can to you. It doesn't mean that we don't seek justice, but it does mean that these little slights and these hurts that we carry around, these little hopes for vengeance that we nurse, those things that, wanting to visit hurt back on hurt, those are part of that sin nature with which we're contending. So Hosea ends with this final comment from the prophet. Who is wise? Let them realize these things. Who is discerning? Let them understand. The ways of the Lord are right. The righteous walk in them, but the rebellious stumble in them. So, having looked now at these kind of summary statements about Boaz and Hosea, two of our great bridegrooms of the Old Testament, I'm going to give you another table talk, which is, what are the ways of the Lord that Boaz and or Hosea demonstrate to you? In the Easter week, in liturgical churches, one of the icons that they use to focus their attention on the attributes of Jesus is called Ecce Homo in Latin. You may recall that we used this painting by Antonio Cesari a few years back in our Easter Way of the Cross presentation to bring our attention to this scene. Of course, it's the scene where Pilate is presenting Jesus to the crowd and says, "Here is this man," which in Latin is Ecce Homo. Now, this painting isn't an icon, but if you go to a traditional church, you'll see that they use a more traditional icon painting like the one on the screen now. This icon is also known as Christ, the bridegroom, and I find this notion to be a deeply challenging notion. You see that he is arrayed with the symbols of power, a crown, a staff, a royal robe, but you also see that they're these like humble symbols, right? The crown is the crown of thorns. The staff is just it looks like a bamboo shoot, and the royal robe has been placed there by the Romans. You see this aspect of humility and the submission of Christ to his circumstances. You see the price that he's paying for his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he says to God, "Don't make me drink from this cup." And he says, "But not my will, yours be done." This is the will of God for the Messiah in this moment. You see whatever is commendable about the heart of Hosea is embodied even more perfectly. And this is the bridegroom. Icons tend to be flattened paintings that aim for spiritual depth in the imagery without overly emotionalizing the faces or the gestures of the subjects. What you see in this rendering of the icon of the bridegroom is so profound, though, that it can't be completely flattened without doing disservice to how challenging a notion this is, that the job of bridegroom is self-sacrifice, right? Interestingly enough, the icon that comes after the icon of the bridegroom in the Eastern Orthodox Easter procession actually jumps back a couple of chapters to earlier in the story, and it's the one that shows Jesus washing the feet of the disciples. You'll usually see Peter as the one that Jesus is washing, and the profundity of this moment has also caused this artistic tradition to develop, where we see Peter's arms set in such a way as to express his incredulity that the Messiah, the Lord of all creation, would be performing the task of servant, and for him, no less, a lowly fisherman. Now, this moment in Holy Week is typically celebrated on Maundy Thursday as well, and that Maundy name comes from the Latin of John 13, verse 34, that you can see on the screen. One of the themes that we've been working through as we've been going through our study in Hebrews and then coming into our Advent weeks has been that in Jesus we see that God's timeless and abstract qualities, his truth, his justice, his mercy, his faithfulness, his moral perfection, his love, are embodied. The responsibility then of those who put their trust in God is to follow in Jesus' footsteps, and in our own way, in our own space and time in which we operate, to also enact and embody God's truth in our lives. Both last week in our discussion of joy and the week before in our discussion of peace, Nicole and Doug gave us the notion that these, joy and peace, are not passive things to just feel and be happy about, but are positive things to enact. Jesus says that the peacemakers will be called children of God, the peacemakers, in Matthew 5, verse 9. Paul instructs the Thessalonians, after a lot of difficult instructions and warning about the dangerous times in which they live, to rejoice always, pray continually, and give thanks in all circumstances. After Jesus has already washed the disciples' feet in John's rendering of the Last Supper in John chapter 15, Jesus tells the disciples that they are going to be known by their love, that they should remain in his love, and that no love is greater than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. And Jesus has just gone about modeling this, and he's about to model this in the most extreme way that he can. These are fairly straightforward teachings, but like the best stuff that you read in the scriptures, simple doesn't always mean easy. Love is at the very top of these simple but not easy things. It is simple to be instructed to love somebody, but it's not always easy to enact that. So, to close our reflection today, I'm going to bring your attention to a poem that's written by G.K. Chesterton a little over 100 years ago. It's called The Wise Men. Step softly under snow or rain to find the place where men can pray. The way is all so very plain that we may lose the way. Oh, we have learnt to peer and pore on tortured puzzles from our youth. We know all labyrinthine lore. We are the three wise men of yore, and we know all things but the truth. We've gone round and round the hill, and lost the wood among the trees, and learnt long names for every ill, and served the mad gods, naming still the Furies, the Eumenides. The gods of violence took the veil of vision and philosophy, the serpent that brought all men bale. He bites his own accursed tail, and calls himself eternity. Go humbly. It is hailed and snowed, with voices low and lanterns lit. so very simple is the road that we may stray from it. The world grows terrible and white, and blinding white the breaking day. We walk bewildered in the light, for something is too large for sight, and something much too plain to say. The child that was, ere worlds begun, we need but walk a little way, we need but see a latch undone. The child that played with moon and sun is playing with a little hay. The house from which the heavens are fed, the old strange house that is our own, where tricks of words are never said, and mercy is as plain as bread, and honor is as hard as stone. Go humbly, humble are the skies, and low and large, and fierce the star, so very near the manger lies, that we may travel far. Hark, laughter like a lion wakes, to roar to the resounding plain, and the whole heaven shouts and shakes, for God himself is born again. And we are little children, walking through the snow and rain. In our society, where technology and philosophical and scientific sophistication have driven truth from our minds, may we be confronted with mercy as plain as bread and with honor as hard as stone. May we be challenged by the child who made the sun, the moon, and the stars, who humbled himself to play with a little hay. May we learn the wisdom of the wise men who worshipped at the foot of the one who would wash their feet. And may we be empowered by the Holy Spirit to enact the love of the bridegroom in our communities. I'm going to give you a table talk to wrap up. Do you need to receive God's love in some way, or do you need to share God's love in some way? Take some time to pray for each other.